here. And at this time, I want to thank GrayMatter Systems, and they are sponsoring our next panel, and it's called Resiliency in Cybersecurity. So please welcome Scott Christensen, the cyber practice lead at GrayMatter, who will introduce the panelists as well as moderate the discussion. So thanks so much. Appreciate you being here, and thank you, David.
It's a great speech, David. That was nice. Thank you, Audrey, for introduction. Hi, everybody. Scott Christensen. As Audrey mentioned, I'm the cyber practice director for GrayMatter Systems. And we're going to talk about cyber resiliency. So when we talk about cyber resiliency, we're talking about the ability of an organization to kind of continue operations by being able to prepare for, respond, and recover from cyber threats. A resilient organization can adapt to unknown crises, threats, and challenges. And really the goal of an organization is to be able to thrive when an incident occurs. Today, we're going to have a couple of guests. We unfortunately had someone drop off, but we do have a couple of guests to talk about their experiences and kind of the different facets of developing a good resiliency program. So first with us, we have Dr. Trevor Evans. Trevor, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Trevor. I am the CISO of Dollar Bank and also teach online for Southern New Hampshire. And I'll be talking about cyber resiliency. I a long time, but I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time.
And also with us, we have Peter Zorinsky. Peter?
Hey, everyone. Peter Zorinsky here. I'm the information security architect with Koppers. I guess if briefly, so for those who aren't familiar with Koppers, they're an integrated global producer of carbon compounds, chemicals, treated wood products for number of different industries, including railroad, specialty chemical, utility, residential lumber, agriculture. We're headquartered out of Pittsburgh, but we do have a presence in a number of countries: North America, South America, Europe, Australia. I believe, I think one of the things that you were asking, Scott, was really, what makes us passionate, as we were talking before about cybersecurity, right? And I would say for me, my passion really lies in two terms, or its importance and visibility. So, cybersecurity, as we're going to talk here, it's critical for both resilience and sustainability for a business. It's really given me much more visibility. It's allowed me to interact directly with the business much more directly. Before I moved into this role, I was a network engineer and in operations. If you've ever worked in that, you're in the background. Mm-hmm. And so now, I appreciate the visibility of my efforts and the ability to interact directly with, business leaders as well as leaders in the community. So,
okay, and I guess we'll start with that. When you think of resiliency, I'll start with you, Peter. What does it really resiliency mean to you?
Resiliency specific to cyber resiliency, really, I think everybody may look at that differently depending on your business environment, your experience. For me, again, having started my career in infrastructure, right, resiliency was kind of built into my career at that time. Looking at whether or not you've got redundancy at a link level, at a network core level, different service providers. Do you have backups for your configurations? Do you have spares? Do you keep these on site? Do you keep them off site? So there's a lot of things to consider there. From a business perspective, things will change depending on your business model. Are you data centric? Are you in healthcare, perhaps manufacturing like Koppers? For Koppers, focusing on manufacturing and sales, really, it begins with protecting the assets that can't be resilient. In a business, there are some facets that, if it were to be impacted, like for us, our process control systems. There's chances where if those get impacted, we could have a loss of life. You may not be able to recover from that, right? So taking all the effort you can to protect those things as best as possible. And then when that's been addressed, really looking at all the systems that can be resilient and building resiliency around those, right? Mm-hmm. And continuous reevaluation of those, right? Because as time changes, as you've seen even with COVID, right? Those critical assets or those critical needs might change over time. So you have to constantly reevaluate that. And I know I'd mentioned sustainability, but earlier, but Koppers recently introduced a corporate sustainability team, and really focusing on making sure Koppers remains an ongoing sustainable business. And, although sustainability, and resilience are two different things, one focusing on longevity, one focusing on recovery, you really can't have a sustainable business without being resilient as well. So.
And Trevor, kind of what are your thoughts on resiliency? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so excuse me, I would definitely echo Peter's thoughts. I tend to think about it in two ways, the how and the why. So for Dollar Bank, we are one of the largest mutual savings banks, very integrated with the community. How are we in business? It's because people feel that their money is safe with us. So really, to me, I look at operational risk. I also have to look at reputation risk. So, whether it's banking or any of us that are on here with your various industries, your customers and their faith in your company, once that gets shaken, great if you're able to recover. But what if everybody says, well, yeah, they recovered, but I don't feel safe, so I'm going to go somewhere else, left with. And, I have to think about that part of it. And then the how can I reassure executive management, the board, et cetera, that we have a cyber resilient program in place and that we can rely on it. So, much as Peter said, that, thinking through all of the tools, all of the possible situations that can come up, and how can we prepare for, get ahead of this, even down to, do we have active DDoS protection, just basically every nightmare scenario. Many of us in this field, well, actually, I shouldn't speak for anybody else. For me, I'm not happy unless I'm stressed or worried about something. So I fit really well with this role. So I stress and worry about every possible thing that could happen, and then I go try to do something about it. So if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I think that's kind of a lot of us in security. That's how we ended up here, is we think about the worries, right? I always used to make the joke that I'm a tinfoil hat wearer, and then I realized, they don't make tinfoil anymore. It's really aluminum, and it's a conductor. That's a whole nother discussion on protection, right? So when you're thinking about this, and I'm going to ask this to Trevors, when you think about your program, how do you identify the gaps in your program?
So this is, again, one of my favorite / least favorite things to think through, but there's a number of ways to do that. First of all, do you have a program in place? And, thinking about it, your companies. With that knowledge, if you step into the role of a malicious actor, a bad guy, bad gal, how can what would he or she do to try to get in? And even depending upon where your level of tech is, thinking about, okay, just looking at what the trends are out there. People are looking at either the ransomware or David mentioned the VMware issue right now. And are we prepared for that? And the other part too is I can look at something so long and it's, what's the phrase? Can't see the forest through the trees. Used to looking at it, sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can help. And that can be an internal partner if your company is large enough to have a second line of defense, if not third line of defense audit. May help, and external partners to have somebody take a look. And it's not just vulnerability testing, it's look at the program overall. And what do you include? And with that, I mean, don't forget about your third parties. There's vendor due diligence. All of us pretty much probably have things hosted off-site. It's great if something's in the contract for that, but what does that actually mean in real life when that would happen? And these are the conversations, either pre-purchase or ongoing through vendor due diligence, that I would recommend having with those third parties. And really also as a singular exercise, I like to step aside and look for single points of failure. So it's great if everything's in line and everything should work, and our tabletops, those work out. We have action items, we're off and running. But in the event, okay, we're relying on this one thing. What if that one thing doesn't work? Or, okay, there's this one gate entry point that everybody's going through. Do we have a backup internet circuit? Or, do we have another firewall or router that we can roll over? Things like that. So really just thinking through every horrible possible thing that could happen and then preparing for it.
And I'm going to take this one from the audience. This is a pretty good one from Justin. With regards to resiliency, do you have any thoughts about the idea that society should maintain analog alternatives to function in the face of prolonged disrupted network resources? And I'll throw that at you first, Peter.
I mean, I think that would make sense, but then you also have to look at the technology, right? From an analog side, is the technology going to be supported down the road, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that would make sense, but again, like everything else, is that technology going to be sustainable, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the big question there. Is it's great to, if you want to keep a walkie-talkie around just in case your phones don't work, right? But what if you can't get batteries for? I don't know, just right. It just depends, because look at how much analog technology has gone by the wayside and just not even available at this point.
Yeah, and in my world, because I live in breathe operational side of the house, which is still trying to maintain kind of updating from serial and analog to more digital network devices. This is something we deal with kind of pretty consistently, and the struggle you have is exactly what you're talking about. I've got customers who, for example, are buying equipment off eBay because vendors aren't manufacturing them anymore. And so the only way they can survive is they keep an inventory of backup. So it creates a different challenge, I think, when you approach it that way. That kind of leads us great, because it was also the next kind of question I had was, when you look at the recent events like Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds, have they changed or modified the way you approach your cybersecurity resiliency? And I'll throw that one at you again, Peter.
Well, so with the heavy media coverage around the pipeline, around SolarWinds, I can only assume that most, if not everyone on this meeting knows what happened, right? They're familiar with these incidents. They're both great examples of how two very different companies, they can be breached and severely impacted, but it also shows, to me, it showed how, the breach of one company can proliferate, right? And it can impact not only, thousands of other businesses out there, but, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of consumers, like the pipeline, where gas prices to skyrocket. And to be honest, while it may not have really dramatically changed my team's thinking to cybersecurity, it has, from a business level, re-emphasized cybersecurity to the business. There was a time years back where, in Koppers risk evaluation, cybersecurity was considered a high risk. And, it's one of those things where we were doing a very good job, and we are still doing a very good job, and doing so well, they said, okay, we don't have to worry about cybersecurity as much. And they took it off that risk, if you would, that high level risk area. And it's been recently reintroduced. Regardless of our efforts in doing still good, they said, no, we need to focus back on this and make sure that things are being done properly. One thing I would add to that too is that, despite the emphasis on these two big breaches, there's other things happening out there that many people aren't familiar with, right? Such as, the National Defense Authorization Act, where all of a sudden they came out and said, hey, if you're using these type of devices manufactured from China, you have to take them out. And whether, although that was directly impacting federal related companies, Koppers, although we don't have direct relations with federal companies, we have customers. And these customers come back and say, look, if they're asking us for this, we're going to ask you for this. And so now all of a sudden you're finding, okay, I'm in cybersecurity, but now I'm worried about cameras out there, right? Which would be more of a physical security thing. The other big one would be the fall of the US GDPR privacy shield, right? So with the Schrems II Act, all of a sudden it's like, okay, GDPR was already hard enough to get your hands around it. Now it's much more difficult, right? So, again, there's just, again, emphasizing that there's a lot of things that are happening out there that, if, that isn't going out to the public all the time, but are equally important and impactful.
Trevor, what are your thoughts on kind of even the initial Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds, but also I think Peter leads into the the other things that not everyone's aware of? What are the things that are impacting or changing your approach to cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I would echo some of Peter's thoughts, and I don't know that it necessarily on it, but I use any opportunity to get cyber as a conversation piece among the board, among executives, openly and unashamedly. And in the more publicized cases, they don't really understand what it means. But they know the word SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange Server. They don't know what that is, but they can say it. They know cyber, and they know that's bad. So, Dr. Evans, can you tell us about that? Well, thank you for asking. Yes, I can. And off I went. But the one thing that I will say is, as these things were publicized, SolarWinds kind of being the first such thing is, we had a response prepared. We knew what our environment was, as safe, this, that, and the other, but also preparing of, okay, I wrote a statement, I ran it through legal, and should anybody happen to ask me for it, here you go. But then the other part of that, and when I had mentioned partners, okay, did you reach out to your other third parties that may be housing customer PII information? And did you get a statement on them, and what are they doing? And beyond that, what about critical infrastructure? Should we be worried about our internet service lines or not? And again, just having those conversations, thinking through them, and then reflecting on the overall resiliency, what would happen if we had to restore back a certain file or a group of files before November. Does our backup strategy allow us to do that? So those kind of conversations I thought were coming up. And to Peter's point about some of the things that maybe aren't as well known, I like to sprinkle those as a factoid in some of the reports I bring to the board to try to keep them updated. And sometimes they jump on that. Sometimes it's more of an informational thing, but again, as a conversation piece, it's weirdly kind of helped.
And when you start to think about strategies when it comes to cyber resiliency, right? What are the most crucial ones, the ones that you think everybody should at least follow these one or two things? And I'll leave it with you, Dr. Evans, first.
Yeah, so really a lot of this goes back to basics. Yes, the threats are changing from day to day, but my battery is running low. Let me make sure I'm plugged in. But thinking through tabletops to me are kind of a basic thing, but how many of us really do them? They're one of my favorite things to do, is to step into the shoes of a malicious actor, think like him or her, think through, okay, NCFTA or, other entities out there, the ISACs that are out there, SANS, they probably publish or will help with, here's a sample tabletop. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can adapt from that. But if you also know your own weaknesses, you look at the risks, or there's just something in particular that keeps you up at night, be it on the news, be it, hey, I know this process isn't quite what it should be. Even though they're telling me X, I know it's really Y. Let's put that to the test. And if there's something in particular I'm worried about, I like to do a tabletop where that scenario actually plays out, worst case scenario, and let everybody else come to the conclusion that I was worried about. And I take that as an action item that then goes on the formal risk register as an output from that tabletop that has to be remediated. Senior management looks at it, internal audit looks at it. So, just me running around saying, hey, I'm worried about this versus this is a formal thing now that we have to fix. That's a little different. And as I mentioned before, going through the third parties, and the DDoS, a single protection, single point of failure. But to, David in the last session was talking about cybersecurity insurance, and oh my goodness, yes, we all must have it. And by the way, don't count on using it, and really it's there and you should have it, but you should never use it. And I think that understanding does not always translate because, oh, well, we have cyber insurance, right? Count to 10, breathe in, breathe out. Yes. And you understand why we should never have to use that, right? I could go on, but again, just the basics. And I like to align to frameworks where possible. And just really thinking through everything, what can possibly go wrong.
Good. So Peter, so let's take the other side of that. So when we think about strategies now, let's think of what are the common mistakes people make, or what are the things you think people should avoid when they're getting started or they're looking at resiliency? What are the things that they think most often they overlook, or just, they implement one or the other that you think probably they should probably look at it in a different way?
I guess for me, a couple things that stand out there is one, not utilizing other resources beyond your own internal resources, right? I think Trevor may have mentioned this earlier, right? But for Koppers, one of the things that we did early off in our program, and not so much, not just resiliency, but in our cybersecurity program, was bringing in a third-party vendor to evaluate all of our systems. It's easy to look at things and try to think you see the gaps that you may have out there, but bringing another set of eyes, as Trevor had mentioned, is really critical to that. Not utilizing that resource, it would be a mistake, right? Not doing that. The other would be, for me, testing, right? A lot of companies, or I would see where, you think you've got resiliency in place, but you don't actually test it. And so, talking through the tabletop exercises that are necessary, something as simple as just doing a DR test, right? Doing a backup recovery test, just making sure that, although you may feel that you've got everything in place, you don't know till you test that. And not only, by doing so that, going back to an earlier question about identifying gaps in your program, that's one way that you would identify those gaps is through testing. It'll prove to you where things may or may not be working as you think they would be. So I think those are two that stand out.
Yeah, and as an organization that does a lot of third-party assessment work for organizations, I appreciate that. But yeah, I think that's important. I think a lot of times when we talk to customers, it's that objective, view of what your environment looks like. And when we look at it, a lot of times when I think about it, say we take the NIST CSF, for example, where we most often see kind of failures, and I'd love to hear y'all's kind of thoughts on this, is documentation. So as we go through and we're assessing and reviewing, a lot of times you might be doing the right things, you may be approaching them the right way, but I think a lot of times the documentation is what's the shortfall. Any thoughts on that? And I kind of let everyone kind of wrap up with their final thoughts, and we'll finish up for the day. So Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that, speaking of resiliency, there's a lot of challenges regarding resiliency, right? And documentation is one of those challenges, right? But I think that falls under this big scope of, time, effort, and funding, right? So, and by that, I mean, working in cybersecurity, there's a lot of responsibilities that we have. You're responding to incidents, you're evaluating, you may be doing documentation or, evaluating an application, reviewing logs. And unfortunately, even from, going one more time back to my infrastructure work that I've done in the past, right? Documentation tends to be the last thing you get to, right? Because there's so much more important stuff that, well, you feel as important, and yet you just don't have the time to really put into it. So documentation is obviously critical, right? But not only that, but also just like testing your systems, testing your documentation, going through that documentation to make sure it's accurate and it's up to date and actually applies to your systems as they are today versus, 2 years ago or 5 when the document was created.
Exactly. Trebor, appreciate you coming back. We were just kind of giving everyone's kind of final thoughts. What would you like everyone to kind of, as they leave here, what are some of the thoughts that you think they should leave with, or things that, words of wisdom you'd like to pass along?
So speaking of resilience, when your primary interface to your customers crashes in the middle of giving a presentation, you have another laptop to pull over and quickly get in to share your thoughts.
Very quick recovery. Very quick.
Yeah, that counts as a test. I'm marking it. But it really just, I would say the ongoing, we talked about the government regulations coming down and things like that have maybe been mentioned or in the news. You know, one of the things I've seen, not at my current company, but through my whole history of working is, you know, cyber gets attention when things go bad or when something's in the news. So when things are quiet, making sure that we still are keeping up, and you know, if we have to capitalize on, hey, you know, something's wrong, so throw some money at it. Yeah, I don't, you know, within ethics, of course, but you know, at the end of the day, you have to protect your company.
And I think that's a saying I've always kind of held, is when we do our jobs well, nothing happens.
Right.
That's, and I with that, I think I really appreciate your time today, both of y'all. It was I think very enlightening. I really enjoyed the conversation, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Audrey and Monica.
Oh, I think one of the things I'd like to do, Scott, before because we have some time, is that there are some questions. There's at least one question right now. Okay. And I'm not sure if there'll be some others as you start to do that. So I'd love to use this opportunity to have a conversation. If you could moderate that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see it? Do you see Justin? And then do you see Michael Russell? So we have time.
We covered, okay, there we go. We covered Justin's question a little bit on the fly in there. So, but I'll cover Michael's. I did not see it. Why isn't documentation remediated by response to the audit report? And I'll leave it to who would like to cover that one.
Yeah, well, so there's one thing, when I look at my job, there's security and then there's compliance. If you're doing one side, the other should be covered as a seesaw, but should it really? At the end of the day, I look at it as, yes, I need that check mark on paper, not, and please don't anybody take that as me thinking that's unimportant. It is very important. But I look at it through the eyes of, okay, here's our response. And by the way, if this really happened, would this control truly be effective in the event of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big distinction people don't always make, that compliance does not necessarily relate to secure. I mean, I can be very compliant and still not be any more secure. But the intent behind compliance is to try to achieve some level. I think it's a lot of times that's missed when we start thinking about, how do we protect our environments? Is, if I take NIST, or if I take even NERC, which is the power utilities regulations, even in the early days, they were simple like, I could check box and say, do you have a firewall? Well, yes, I have a firewall. It doesn't say I have any rules in place, that I have policy enforcement, I'm not blocking anything, but I have a firewall. So I'm compliant, but I'm not any more secure. So I think a lot of times that's where the disconnect comes, is that we're in a rush to meet a standard, or a rush to achieve a level of compliancy, which in itself is a good goal, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the risk associated with it. And I think that's when we take a step back and we want to look at that. Do we understand what are our compensated controls around the risk? And I think, Peter, the fact that you guys have a little bit of an operational network too, there's a whole different kind of view towards the risk and resiliency when it comes to kind of the operational side of the house. I don't know if you'd like to share some of your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I would actually add to the previous statement, and say that when it comes to auditing, right? So for Koppers, the only true requirement we have is SOX, right? So if all we're doing is meeting SOX, there's so many other important things out there that are not looked at in that audit. So audits are only going to touch certain aspects of the business. To your point here, audits not, SOX compliance isn't going to ask us where's our redundancy within our systems, right? It's not going to, they may even ask, do you have backups in place, right? Yes or no? Yeah, we do. When's the last time it was tested though? And you might start digging a little deeper and realize, hey, again, Trevor, you're checking the box saying it's there, but it doesn't mean it's going to work until you test it. All right. And again, my biggest, going back to that first statement, is there's just so much more to a company depending on what compliance you have. Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's the other part, is when we start to look at what are we complying to. I think when we look at the regulatory side, and I think we can all kind of talk about the evolution of where we're going with regulations. But on top of that, I also think when we look at standards, when you guys look to adhere to a standard, is there one particular that you guys lean on more than others?
For Koppers, we try to lean more towards the NIST framework and standards, right? So I know for us, it might be a little more rigorous than necessary for a manufacturing company where we may start falling more towards CIS. But I know it's been great for us to use NIST as a framework, not only for, you know, the cybersecurity model, but also building out a framework for the organization, the IT organization, and who covers what facets of the cybersecurity model out there.
Yeah, and I think the thing I like about NIST as well is you can build your maturity around NIST, right? You can develop your program, because I think that's when we start talking about how do I start, and I'm going to leave this with you, Trevor. When I'm starting a program out, when I'm looking to, you know, measure the risk associated with it, what are the steps that you think we should look at for starting a program?
Yeah, well, and first of all, defining what you're going to measure against. You know, in banking, we have FFIC IT handbooks, which are not a regulation. That being said, we are judged against it by our regulator. So we treat it as a regulation. And oh, by the way, it's built on top of GLIBA, GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley, how do you keep customer information safe, which, by the way, doesn't tell you how to do it. So that's great. And then basically NIST, if you've got programming in or development, excuse me, are you following OWASP standards? And, you know, against that, I really like the CIS controls. So where I can, going towards that, but as far as rolling it out, you know, look at it in phases. What are your most critical assets? You know, do you start with internet accessible DMZ and work your way in? Do you look at it as anything with customer information? Really just taking a standard and rolling it out in phases. And I've always been a big fan of maturity. Cliches, one of my favorite, boil the ocean. I can't do everything in a day. So what can we do? What's achievable? Because you have to look at what is reasonable and achievable that you can show results on. And then over time, as a strategy over the next couple of years, whether it's short-term, long-term, where are you aiming at getting? So the FFIEC puts out a cybersecurity assessment tool, abbreviated CAT or CAT. They actually have translated some of the controls built on a 5-level maturity model. So that's something to look at. Now, granted, that's for the financial industry. However, the controls that are in there, I would argue, apply industry-wide. You know, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, their risk assessment, really just pick an area, define where you want to go, what you're trying to protect, roll it out, and what is your maturity or goal level over time.
And I think we talked a little bit about this too, and I kind of want to re-emphasize this a little bit when we think about the term assessment, right? And I think one of the things we talk about when you get that third-party view, I think it's important to measure versus previous, did we accomplish those identified risks? Because I think one of the most frustrating things for me as someone who does quite a few assessments is to know that someone here who's here a year before, you had all the same identified risks, and we didn't measure, did we make any progress or maturity against those identified risks? So I think it's when we talk about assessments, I think maybe you guys want to kind of chime in and thoughts on, you know, what it looks like to kind of build the cyclicality or the cycle of assessing and making sure there's an action plan that's followed up. And Peter, I'll let you kind of, since you initially talked about assessments, what are your thoughts on coming back to your assessments and making sure that you've achieved those risk mitigation strategies?
Yeah, so for Koppers, what we've done actually specific to that point is when we had that third-party risk assessment done, you know, several years ago now, we used that assessment and our work with that third party to build a 5-year roadmap to cybersecurity, right? And so you have a roadmap built out to guide you, right? Not only, you know, where to focus your work, but where to focus funding, right? Because you can't do everything at once. So building out that roadmap was critical for us, but also having regular reevaluation of that roadmap, because over time, you know, certain things that may have been critical to the business, you know, 3 years ago are not critical today. So certain things may fall off that roadmap, certain things may be added to that roadmap. And then I also feel it's also critical to, at some point, have a new assessment plan, to have a third party come back in and say, okay, we think we've done all this. Can you reassess and see where these gaps may be today? You know, for us, I think that's been very successful to our program.
Yeah, and I can echo that. And going back to the maturity levels, so whatever maturity level you have, regulatory may help you depending upon your industry. So in banking, where you have to do a risk assessment, it doesn't have to be the CAT, although unofficially it pretty much does, at least in my experience. And whatever our inherent risk on that assessment is, there's a certain level, and if we don't have 100% compliance with those bottom however many levels, that becomes treated as a stop, drop, and roll, because we're then out of compliance, and that gets a lot of attention. Now, that's one angle, but that doesn't help me holistically. What about those things up here? What about those things that aren't necessarily on that risk assessment? And with that, I think it comes down to buy-in, and especially executive support or board support of your efforts. And in presenting your cyber program to the board, be it annually or however often you do, or if you don't, working that into as a new thing, making sure that this is presented to and accepted by the board. And going and putting a project in to move to a different kind of technology or do this is received a lot differently with, and by the way, this is approved by the board of directors. So there you
go. Question from the audience. Will anyone mention high trust CSF? And I'll probably turn that over to you, Trevor, if you want to discuss the high trust CSF.
Yeah, so a little bit out of my industry,
okay.
but again, it's, whether you're talking about HIPAA, high trust, NERC, across different industries, and David had mentioned I think he had mentioned, forgive me, is, mapping between all of the different frameworks that are out there. At the end of the day, it's good security. There's, we're going back a number of years, but if I remember correctly, there's an ITIL principle of was industry standard, good security, and best security. And I may be quoting that wrong, but the best isn't what you would think. It's good, meaning you take from the industry, you take from the best, you pull it into what you're going to use. Now, you have to meet whatever the regulations are. So over and above that, whatever you're going to do as a best security practices, I'm not afraid to look at across industries. So, well, okay, I'm not necessarily in COVID every day, but this one control they're talking about here, do I have that in there? Does that map to what I'm doing over here? Am I missing something?
Yeah. And I think that's important too. I think when you look at, you take that objective standard, and I think across whatever industry, but you also look where I can borrow pieces, because there's so many standards out there and so many industries have their approach to it. So for example, just in operational side, we've got NIST, we've got 171, we've got 800, we've also got IEC and ISA, and we've got so many of these different standards. But at the end of the day, you take one, and I think even I'm a big proponent of, you take one and then you modify it to your needs. So you borrow from others, you take that kind of best hybrid approach, regardless of what industry you're in. And I think that's kind of the good hygiene part of building a cyber program, is giving myself a measurable, objective way to see where my risk is and putting in the appropriate compensating controls. I'm happy to take any other questions, guys, or we can keep going. We can keep talking about frameworks. We can keep talking about metrics, but happy to take any more questions that you might have from the audience. So here's one of my other ones that I guess we'll go with. This is, what role does each employee play when it comes to cyber resiliency? Peter, I'll throw that one at you.
Really, just I think that depends on the employee's role, right, within the company. For us, we expect our employees to be educated and at least knowledgeable on cybersecurity and the known risk out there. From a leadership level, right, I feel the role that leadership has really is support, as Trevor mentioned, right, is support for the program, acknowledgement of the importance of cybersecurity, down to, you know, within the business models, making sure that, you know, communication within the business and getting feedback from the business leaders, or even others that, you know, letting us know what's critical to the business so that we know where to focus our roles. But that, you know, a lot of that comes back to me and my team and us driving those questions, right? So I think everyone does have some role, but at the same time, you know, the old idea of like, you know, having an end user being your greatest risk, right? Well, then it's our job to try to remediate that risk as much as possible from a cybersecurity side.
And Trevor, when you think about building it, what are the roadblocks that you've encountered in building a kind of a cyber program?
So I won't mention which company this was with, but when I went to roll out a data classification policy, I was met with from high above, well, because we don't have this in place now, you're saying this is a policy, so this is basically an immediate audit finding. How can you roll this out? So, okay, step left a little bit. Here's my data classification standard. And oh, by the way, that's going to be included in my annual mandatory security awareness training. Over the years, more of the test questions began to creep in about, you know, how would you classify this data? Remember, we showed you on this. And as a company moves into a cloud, I stood in the way and said, you're not going to do this until we have that data classified. It's not in our four walls, so I can't. I am now bringing this as a risk to the bank that I'm standing in your way of your project and your strategy to protect the bank. So a little bit of a different way to approach it, but at the end of the day, you know, as a circus performer, if you give me 5 flaming hoops, okay, let's go.
I think it kind of leads into another good question I'd like to. So how has the cloud evolved your thoughts on both resiliency and cybersecurity? And I'll kind of start with you, Peter, on this one.
I would say from resiliency, it's actually been a great benefit to us, right? Because I'll go back to infrastructure, and there's resiliency, you know, depending on what platform or what you're looking at doing in the cloud, but there's some resiliency that you're getting inherently with many of these platforms now. The other part, though, is when you're starting to look at other aspects, you know, something as simple as backups, right? So, you know, having to reevaluate, you know, what you have in place now, and you're going to have to step back and say, okay, we need to reassess what we have and how we're going to emulate our existing on-prem processes in the cloud and where possible. So again, I think in some ways it's actually just inherently benefited us, and in other ways it's added new challenges of trying to reevaluate and reassess how we're doing different aspects of cyber resiliency.
And Trevor, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on it too, but I also want you to think about that the data is no longer in your control. And I think that's always, when we talk to security, we have this mindset of control. So how do you rectify that as well as the added benefit of resiliency?
Right. And, you know, again, having the right controls in place, but back to a couple comments that others have brought up, having the humility to say, I need help. I don't have certification X and Y in cloud technology Z. So rather than me standing up and saying, well, yeah, sure, it's secure. How about let's bring in a SME who knows what they're doing, give an assessment, work with us to make sure that those controls are in place. And I am a big fan of then using a different third party once the program is in place to immediately look at that from a fresh pair of eyes as a source of validation. You know, trust but verify is a good audit saying that I like to follow. Great that this SME told me to do it this way. Does that mean that I can sleep at night? Well, let's get another validation on that.
Great. And so when you think about kind of the future of cybersecurity and kind of future of building a program, what are the kind of key components that you think people should be aware of or think that they should be approaching from a thought standpoint, things that they should definitely be investigating. And I'll leave it with you first, Trevor.
Yeah, and really I think that, one of the, I've noticed, at least from the banking industry, is that our regulators are taking a wait and see approach. They are saying you still have to protect everything, but we're not going to opine yet on how you're doing that. You tell us. So that's kind of something, and I don't know if the other industries have had to deal with that with their regulators. But yeah, really just say, what are the controls? How are they in place? And just because somebody wants to put something out there doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do. Question the why and put some of the onus back on the requester. Say, how is this going to be secured? At the end of the day, it's still my problem. But I do like to get everybody thinking about the cyber aspect of it.
We've got another question from the audience. So I'm going to throw this one at you, Peter. To reduce the impact of possible breach, do you have any thoughts on the kind of data organizations should not digitize or should periodically purge from their databases?
Yeah, I mean, you should have. I know for us, GDPR has actually come into this as well with the right to purge data. But for us, there's actually two sides of this. Well, I guess it would fall in line with the same, right? So from a legal perspective, we actually have some retention policies that we have to follow out there to where data has to be purged at a certain time, because not just for legal purposes, right? So if we ever have requests for records, things like that, sometimes maintaining that data for a long time is actually, it's not a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. But specific to data that should not be digitized, I honestly feel at this point, data has to be digitized for businesses nowadays. I don't see how it's, and again, at least thinking from our perspective, right, from a manufacturing perspective, even going down to the process control systems, where at one point may have been something that was an analog system, in order to maintain efficiency, in order to make your systems more productive, digitizing those is a requirement. So I think digitizing is something that has to be done, but that's part of the reason why our roles are so critical, because every day there's more data out there and we just have to protect it.
And Trevor, what are your thoughts on kind of key themes?
Yeah, so, and similar, and maybe this is short-sighted of me, but I'm having trouble coming up with an example of what shouldn't be digitized, at least from within my world, because I don't see that trend. It comes back to, and again, I won't say what company in my past or whatever, but I have run into issues where the company has been hesitant to publish a retention schedule. And in those cases, again, before you go to cloud, or if you inherit something, really focusing on that, making sure that those retention schedules are applied. Some of us have regulations where, maybe a loan document has to be available for so long. Well, okay, what is your source of truth for that record for non-repudiation? Is that out there, or is that something that your archive internal, or is it a piece of paper? What is the answer to that? And as far as that retention schedule, the other piece of that is ensuring that the correct technical controls are in place. Is it actually purging over whatever 3 years, 1 year, 90 days, whatever you've set?
I think it also kind of plays back into that data classification conversation, right? You really want to identify, your classes of data and how you want to handle it, and what's appropriate to be done with the different types of data. And I think when you start thinking and expanding on that as well, and Peter, I think kind of going back to the control center stuff, because once again, that's what we do. So I think a lot of times when we talk about over time, there's also the liability risk. The longer you hold stuff that potentially could cause you different exposures, the longer you back up and store stuff that could be potentially damaging to infrastructure. I think happy to take any more questions from the audience. We're coming close up to the end of time, and I don't know if there's any final thoughts or second final thoughts of everyone leaving. But Peter, I'll let you kind of lead off with the final thoughts.
And I guess the only things I would add, I was thinking earlier as we were talking about cyber insurance, as that come up a few times, but really, you know, resiliency within cybersecurity in some way is almost like your own internal insurance policy, right? So, so you can go out and buy insurance, but you should be doing what you can to build up that, if you would, your own inherent ability to recover without the need for that. Like you see, you know, it's great to have it, but you should never use it, right? You're hoping to never use that. The other part is, you know, we've been talking a lot about resiliency, and I think, you know, the majority of this conversation, if at all, has been around the technical aspects of it. But just, you know, from a managerial perspective, remember that you need resiliency within your team as well. You need to have shared, you know, knowledge and skill sets to make sure that you've got the right people in place, and that to utilize all these systems and applications that you have to ensure your systems are resilient. So
yeah, and I think once again it comes back to my harping on documentation too. I think a lot of times we forget that one of the points behind documentation is what happens when that person's not there, right? Who's gonna be able to follow the process if they're not the ones who maintain it? And I always make a joke in our world, in the industrial world, is I call it finding the Bob. It's the guy that knows everything, who handles everything, but he's going to retire in a year, and once he's gone, no one knows how any of these systems work. I always talk about making sure that you find him, you've got him backed up as much as anything as well. Trevor, any kind of final thoughts you'd like to share?
Some minor ones that, you know, we mentioned tabletops, and during the pandemic, you know, comment may have floated about why on earth would you want to do a tabletop in the middle of the pandemic? And I said, why on earth would I not? This is fantastic. We can think through so-and-so. Nobody is physically in the building and bad things can still happen. Let's step through that. And oh, by the way, let's say there's a Comcast or Verizon outage in North Hills. So the following 3 technical contacts that we normally rely on, sorry, they're not available. What do you do? And the other thing is, you know, yes, cyber resiliency focuses on the technical aspect of it, but again, with thinking through reputation, you know, do you have a communication plan in place? Do you do separate tabletops with your executives and perhaps a PR firm? We've done them where I was the moderator going through, and so the hypothetical, we were breached, it's going to be on the news tonight. We haven't released a statement. Channel 11 is downstairs. They'd like to know if we'd like the chance to make a statement. Who's going to do that and what will it be? And they'll be here for another 3 minutes, and then discussions at 2.5 minutes, and then 2 minutes. So I enjoyed that. I don't think anybody else did, but I certainly did.
Yeah, I think it's, when we think about tabletops, and I think just in general, threat modeling is very underrated as a value, right? It's what would happen if, and how do I model this? How are we going to react to this? And probably my favorite customer I've ever had in my career talks about, he sees his job as avoiding helicopter moments. So he has a bunch of chemical plants, and what he calls a helicopter moment is anytime the news coppers are circling around of his, and he sees cyber as just an extension of safety, as an extension of everything else he does. He says, most of my job as the guy who owns all this is to prevent helicopter moments. And so he thinks of it in that extension. And I think that's something we often lose when cybersecurity discussions is we're part of a bigger process, I guess you would say. And, you know, and regardless of what breaks that process, we need to make sure we understand, how do we recover? How do we reputationally protect ourselves? And, you know, how do we properly communicate throughout that, you know, we've got this, and we can understand where our cyber risks are. So I really want to thank the panelists. I really think this was a great discussion. I'm happy to answer any more questions. And if you guys ever want to reach out to me, feel free to. And with that, I think we can turn this back over.
All right, that was a great session. Thanks everybody. Again, thanks to Scott, and thanks to GrayMatter for sponsoring the panel discussion. There's going to be a super short break. The next session is at 10:30. The way that you're going to get to your next session is you want to either return to Shed, or I think Taylor just posted or should have reposted the link of where you're going to go. And when you get there, you will be placed into a waiting room for a few minutes before we get started. So maybe a good time to jump back in and visit those vendor virtual gift bags while you're waiting. But again, great panel. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks again to Scott and GrayMatter. And we'll see you all over at 10:30 in the next session. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.